Hey there, truth seekers. Picture this. The coldest, most hostile place on Earth might actually be hiding the hottest secret in human history. We're talking about Antarctica, that massive frozen wasteland at the bottom of the world that you probably think is just a giant ice cube where penguins waddle around and scientists occasionally drill holes for fun. Wrong. Dead wrong. What if I told you there are maps from the 1500s showing Antarctica's coastline without ice? 3 centuries before we officially discovered the continent. What if pyramids bigger than Egypt's are sitting under miles of ice right now, and satellite radar has already found them? Buckle up. Because today we're exploring why Antarctica might not be a frozen desert at all, but rather a time capsule preserving evidence of a civilization that existed before everything we thought we knew about human history. Before we dive into this rabbit hole, do me a solid, smash that like button if you're ready to question everything your history teacher told you, and drop a comment letting me know what part of the world you're watching from. I want to see how global this community really is. And fair warning, by the end of this video, you're either going to think I'm crazy, or you're going to be Googling flights to the South Pole. Either way, this is going to be one wild ride through ice, mystery, and possibly the biggest cover-up in modern history. Let's go. So here's the deal. Antarctica is essentially Earth's freezer, a continent-sized block of ice sitting at the bottom of the planet, covered in snow that's been accumulating for millions of years. We're talking about ice sheets that are over 2 miles thick in some places. 2 miles. That's deeper than the Grand Canyon is deep. Except instead of looking down at ancient rock formations in a river, you're standing on top of frozen water that's been piling up since before humans figured out how to make fire without accidentally burning down the entire village. And underneath all that ice? Well, that's where things get interesting. Very interesting. The kind of interesting that makes you question whether your entire understanding of human history might be just slightly off by, a few thousand years or so. Now, when most people think about Antarctica, they picture penguins waddling around looking adorable, maybe some seals lounging on ice floes, and scientists in puffy jackets drilling ice cores for climate data while slowly losing their minds in the 24-hour darkness of Antarctic winter. Which, to be fair, is accurate. But what if I told you that beneath those kilometers of ice, satellite technology has detected structures that shouldn't be there? I'm not talking about natural rock formations or interesting geological features that kind of look like something if you squint hard enough and have a very active imagination. I'm talking about geometrically precise structures, shapes with right angles, parallel lines, and dimensions that make the pyramids of Giza look like a child's sandcastle project at the beach. And we're not talking small either. Some of these anomalies are bigger than the Great Pyramid. Significantly bigger. The kind of bigger that makes you wonder what exactly was going on down there before the ice showed up and turned the whole continent into nature's largest freezer. Here's where it gets wild. The technology we're using to detect these structures is called ground-penetrating radar, which is essentially a way to use radio waves to see through solid objects. In this case, miles of ice. It's the same technology archaeologists use to find buried ruins without having to dig up entire fields, except instead of looking through a few feet of dirt, we're looking through ice that's been accumulating since the Miocene epoch. And what this radar is showing us is genuinely bizarre. We're seeing linear features that run for miles in perfectly straight lines. We're seeing circular formations with diameters measured in hundreds of meters. We're seeing what appear to be massive rectangular structures with walls that are too uniform, too precise, too deliberate to be natural formations. Unfortunately for anyone hoping for a simple explanation, rocks don't naturally form perfect rectangles. Glacial movement doesn't create geometric patterns. Ice doesn't carve out symmetrical structures with 90-degree angles. Nature is chaotic, messy, unpredictable. These formations, they look designed, they look planned. They look like someone sat down with a ruler and a blueprint and said, "Let's build something massive right here in this spot that will eventually become the most inhospitable place on Earth." The implications here are staggering. If these are artificial structures, and that's a big if that comes with a mountain of controversy and debate, then they would have to predate the current ice sheet. And that ice sheet has been there for somewhere between 14 and 34 million years, depending on which part of Antarctica we're talking about. Now, conventional archaeology tells us that the first cities appeared around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. The first pyramids were built around 4,500 years ago. Stonehenge is roughly 5,000 years old. These are considered ancient. These are the structures we point to and say, "Look how advanced our ancestors were." But if there are artificial structures under the Antarctic ice, we're potentially talking about something that's orders of magnitude older. We're talking about a civilization that would make ancient Egypt look like it happened yesterday. We're talking about rewriting everything we think we know about human development, technological advancement, and the timeline of civilization itself. No pressure or anything. And here's the thing that really keeps researchers up at night. Antarctica wasn't always frozen. We know this. We have geological evidence. Core samples tell us that millions of years ago, Antarctica was warm, temperate, and covered in forests. There were rivers, lakes, and a climate that could support life. In fact, we've found fossils of plants and animals that couldn't survive in frozen conditions, which means at some point in the distant past, you could have theoretically gone for a pleasant walk through Antarctic forests without immediately dying of hypothermia. The continent sits at the South Pole because of plate tectonics. It drifted there over millions of years. But it wasn't always a frozen wasteland. It was once a habitable landmass. And if it was habitable, then theoretically, it could have been inhabited by someone or something. Building structures that we're only now discovering with modern technology because they're buried under miles of ice that accumulated over geological timescales. Which brings us to a very uncomfortable question. What if we're not the first advanced civilization on this planet? Now, before you start thinking this sounds like the plot of a science fiction movie, and trust me, it kinda does, let's talk about something that should be impossible, but definitely exists. I'm talking about maps. Old maps. Maps that show Antarctica in detail that shouldn't have been possible given the technology available at the time they were created. And I'm not talking about crude sketches or vague outlines. I'm talking about maps that show coastlines, mountain ranges, and geographical features with accuracy that modern science only confirmed in the 1950s using seismic surveys and aerial reconnaissance. Maps created centuries before Antarctica was officially discovered by European explorers. Maps that show the continent without ice, which, naturally, raises the obvious question. How in the actual hell did medieval cartographers know what Antarctica looked like before it was covered in ice? Let's start with the most famous example, the Piri Reis map. This map was created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis, who was basically the Google Maps of his era, except with significantly more risk of dying from scurvy or being attacked by pirates. The map shows the coasts of Europe, Africa, and South America with remarkable accuracy for the time, which is cool but not shocking. European explorers were actively sailing these routes and making detailed observations. But here's where it gets weird. The southern portion of this map shows a landmass that appears to correspond with the northern coast of Antarctica. And not just any Antarctica, Antarctica as it would look without its ice sheet. The coastline shown on the Piri Reis map matches the actual coastline hidden under the ice, which we only discovered in the 20th century using modern surveying equipment. How did a 16th century Ottoman cartographer have access to information about a continent that wouldn't be officially discovered until 1820? Showing geographical features that were hidden under ice and only confirmed with modern technology in 1949. Spoiler alert. Nobody has a good answer to this question that doesn't involve some serious mental gymnastics. Now, Piri Reis himself claimed he didn't actually discover or survey Antarctica. According to his notes, he compiled his map using older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great, others from even earlier periods. He mentioned using around 20 different source maps, including charts from Arabian, Portuguese, and even more ancient sources. Which means the knowledge of Antarctica's ice-free coastline didn't originate with him. He was just copying information that already existed. He was basically doing what we do today when we screenshot someone else's Instagram post and share it. Except instead of getting likes, he created one of history's most controversial cartographic mysteries. The implication here is absolutely wild. There was a civilization, or multiple civilizations, that possessed advanced geographical knowledge thousands of years ago. They had the navigational capability to sail to Antarctica, survey its coastline, and accurately map it. Then this information got passed down through various cultures, copied from map to map, until it ended up in Ottoman hands in the 16th century. Unfortunately for conventional history, this means someone was sailing around Antarctica and making accurate maps of it before the ice showed up. And that ice has been there for a very, very long time. But wait, it gets better. Or worse, depending on your tolerance for information that completely contradicts everything you learned in school. In 1531, a French cartographer named Orontius Phineas created another map of Antarctica. And this map is even more detailed and troubling for anyone trying to maintain the conventional timeline of human history. The Orontius Phineas map shows Antarctica as a continent-sized landmass centered on the South Pole. It shows mountain ranges. It shows rivers. It shows bays and inlets. It shows an interior region that appears to be ice-free. And here's the kicker. When researchers compared this map to modern surveys of what lies beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, they found the correlations were eerily accurate. The mountain ranges shown on the Phineas map correspond to actual mountain ranges that are currently buried under ice. The rivers match up with subglacial river systems that we only discovered using ground-penetrating radar in the late 20th century. The general shape and proportions of the continent, while not perfect, are far more accurate than they have any right to be for a map created in 1531, centuries before anyone had supposedly set foot on Antarctic soil. Let me put this in perspective. The official discovery of Antarctica is credited to expeditions in 1820. That's when European explorers first confirmed the existence of this frozen continent. But even after its discovery, accurate mapping took decades. Early explorers could only map the coastline they could see. And even that was difficult because of ice shelves, dangerous weather conditions, and the minor inconvenience of possibly dying from cold, starvation, or crushing disappointment. Mapping the interior was essentially impossible until the advent of aerial photography in the 20th century, and later satellite imagery. And mapping what lies beneath the ice? That required seismic surveys and ground-penetrating radar technology that didn't exist until the 1950s and later. Yet here, we have maps from the 1500s showing geographical features beneath the ice with accuracy that shouldn't be possible. It's like finding a detailed map of the moon's far side, dated 1492. It just doesn't make sense within our conventional understanding of technological development and exploration history. Unless, of course, our conventional understanding is incomplete or just wrong. The standard explanation, when historians and geographers are forced to address these maps, usually goes something like this. Well, the cartographers were probably just guessing, or They were copying myths and legends, or it's probably just a coincidence that these maps happen to match actual geographical features, which is the academic equivalent of sticking your fingers in your ears and humming loudly when confronted with uncomfortable evidence. Because here's the thing about coincidences. When you have one unusual map that kind of, maybe, possibly shows Antarctic features, you can chalk it up to luck or artistic interpretation. But when you have multiple maps from different time periods, created by different cartographers from different cultures, all showing similar features that we can now confirm are accurate using modern technology, that's not coincidence. That's a pattern. That's data. That's evidence of something we don't understand, but probably should be paying very close attention to. And it's not just these two maps. There are other examples scattered throughout history. The Philippe Boitier map from 1737 shows Antarctica divided into two separate landmasses by a channel of water, which would only be accurate if you removed the ice sheet, revealing that Antarctica is actually two landmasses connected by ice. We confirmed this in the 20th century. But Boitier knew it in 1737, basing his map on even older sources. The Haji Ahmed map from 1559 shows Antarctica connected to South America by a land bridge that would have existed during the last ice age when sea levels were lower. How did a 16th century cartographer know about ice age geography? These aren't isolated examples. They're part of a larger pattern suggesting that accurate geographical knowledge of Antarctica existed long before the modern age of exploration. Someone, at some point in the distant past, sailed to Antarctica, mapped it in detail, and that information survived through various cultures and civilizations until it ended up being copied by medieval and early modern cartographers who probably had no idea what they were actually looking at. Now, here's where skeptics jump in with what they think is a gotcha moment. They point out that these old maps aren't perfectly accurate. There are distortions, errors, and features that don't quite line up. Which is true. But here's the thing. Of course, there are errors. These maps were copied by hand, often multiple times, over centuries. Each copying introduces errors. Imagine playing a game of telephone, but instead of a simple message, you're transmitting complex geographical data. And instead of 10 people, you're going through dozens of copies over hundreds or thousands of years. The remarkable thing isn't that there are errors. It's that the core information survived at all and remained accurate enough that we can still recognize the features being depicted. It's like if someone handed you a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy of a photograph, and you could still make out enough detail to identify what the original image showed. The fact that any accurate information survived the copying process is borderline miraculous. So what does this all mean? Well, if we take these maps seriously, and the accuracy of the geographical information suggests we should, then we're forced to conclude that at some point in the distant past, there was a civilization or network of civilizations with the maritime technology to explore and map Antarctica before it was covered in ice. This means ocean-going vessels, navigation technology, and the organizational capability to conduct long-distance expeditions and compile that data into maps that could be preserved and transmitted across centuries. This isn't primitive tribal societies working with stone tools. This is advanced civilization with sophisticated technology, operating at a time when conventional history says humans were still figuring out basic agriculture. It suggests a maritime culture that spanned the globe, reaching even the most remote corners of the planet and documenting what they found. And then, for reasons we don't understand, whether from catastrophe, climate change, or the natural rise and fall of civilizations, this knowledge was lost, fragmented, and scattered. But it didn't disappear entirely. It survived in maps, copied and recopied, passed through Persian hands to Arabian hands to European hands, until finally ending up in museums where modern researchers could examine them and realize, wait a minute, this shows information that shouldn't exist. The implications here extend far beyond just cartography. If there was a civilization advanced enough to map Antarctica before the Ice Age, what else did they accomplish? What other knowledge did they possess? What other structures might they have built? And here's the really unsettling part. If they existed and then disappeared, leaving only scattered traces behind, could the same thing happen to us? Are we living under the comfortable assumption that our civilization is the pinnacle of human achievement, when in reality we might just be one more chapter in a much longer story of rise and fall, advancement and collapse? Because that's what these maps suggest. They suggest that someone came before us. Someone mapped the world with a level of accuracy that rivaled our own capabilities until very recently. Someone built structures massive enough to still be visible through miles of ice. And then something happened, whether gradually or catastrophically, and they vanished, leaving behind only fragments of knowledge and structures buried so deep that we're only now beginning to discover them. And here's the beautiful, terrifying truth. The ice is melting. Climate change, whatever your opinion on its causes, is an observable fact. The Antarctic ice sheet is losing mass. Glaciers are retreating. Coastal ice shelves are breaking apart. And as the ice melts, more of what lies beneath is being exposed. We're at the beginning of what might be the greatest archaeological discovery in human history. Not because we're actively searching for it, but because the planet itself is revealing what's been hidden for millennia. The Earth is pulling back the curtain on its own history, whether we're ready for it or not. Structures that have been frozen in time for thousands or millions of years are slowly being revealed. And when they're fully exposed, when we can finally send expeditions to examine them up close instead of relying on radar signatures and satellite data, we're going to have to confront evidence that might completely reshape our understanding of human history, technological development, and our place in the long timeline of civilization on this planet. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it would mean if everything we teach in schools about the development of civilization needs to be revised. If the neat timeline from primitive societies to ancient civilizations to modern industrial society is revealed to be incomplete at best and fundamentally wrong at worst. If we're forced to admit that we're not the first advanced civilization on Earth, we're just the most recent one. That's not just an academic footnote. That's a paradigm shift that affects everything from archaeology to anthropology to our entire conception of human progress and achievement. It means our ancestors, far more ancient than we ever imagined, accomplished things we're only now beginning to understand. It means the conventional story of human civilization is missing entire chapters. And it means those mysterious maps sitting in museums and libraries aren't curiosities or errors. They're evidence. Evidence of a world we've forgotten. Evidence of a history that's been buried under ice for so long that it passed from fact into myth and from myth into oblivion. Until now. Until the ice started melting and the questions started getting hotter than the temperatures at the South Pole have any right to be. So the next time someone tells you Antarctica is just a frozen wasteland with nothing but penguins and research stations, remember those maps. Remember those radar images showing geometric structures beneath the ice. Remember that someone, at some point, knew what that continent looked like before the freeze. And ask yourself, what else are we going to find when the ice finally melts and reveals what's been waiting beneath it all this time? Now, if ancient maps showing impossible knowledge weren't strange enough, let's talk about what happens when you actually try to navigate in certain parts of Antarctica with modern technology. Spoiler alert. Your equipment starts acting like it's possessed. And not in the fun horror movie way, where things get spooky but ultimately explainable. I'm talking about compasses spinning wildly like they're trying to win a breakdancing competition. GPS units showing coordinates that would place you somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean when you're clearly standing on solid ice. And electronic equipment just deciding to take an unauthorized vacation from functionality. And before you think this is just user error or faulty equipment. Because let's be honest, that's usually the explanation when tech stops working. This happens consistently in specific locations. The same spots. Every single time. Which means either Antarctica has the world's most persistent gremlins, or something down there is seriously messing with magnetic fields and electronic systems in ways that physics textbooks say shouldn't be possible. Let's start with the most basic navigation tool known to humanity. The compass. Simple device, right? Magnetized needle points north. Been working reliably for thousands of years. Sailors used them to cross oceans. Explorers used them to map continents. Your grandfather probably had one in his camping gear that still works perfectly. Except in certain areas of Antarctica, compasses don't point north. They don't point anywhere. They spin. They rotate continuously. They point in random directions that change moment to moment. And we're not talking about minor deviations or slight inaccuracies that you'd expect near the magnetic South Pole, which is a known phenomenon and completely normal. We're talking about wholesale magnetic chaos. It's like trying to use your phone's GPS inside a building made entirely of metal, while someone outside is waving giant magnets around for fun. Nothing works the way it's supposed to. And the people experiencing this aren't amateur tourists with cheap equipment from discount outdoor stores. These are professional researchers, military personnel, and pilots with high-grade instruments that cost more than most people's cars. And their equipment is freaking out. Geophysical surveys, the kind that use sensitive instruments to measure magnetic fields, gravitational anomalies, and subsurface structures, have identified massive magnetic anomalies in specific regions of Antarctica. The most notable ones are centered under Lake Vostok, which we'll get to in a minute because that particular location is its own rabbit hole of weirdness, and in an area called Wilkes Land. These aren't subtle fluctuations. These are significant distortions in the magnetic field that suggest the presence of something big under the ice. And when I say big, I mean really big. We're talking about magnetic signatures consistent with enormous metallic objects or massive crystalline structures, objects so large that they're affecting magnetic readings through miles of ice and rock. Which, naturally, raises some interesting questions. What exactly is down there? Because rocks don't usually create magnetic anomalies of this magnitude. Ice definitely doesn't. So what does? Large metallic objects, crystalline formations with specific mineral compositions, or, and here's where it gets fun, artificial structures made from materials that we can detect magnetically even through massive amounts of overburden. Now, the official explanation, when there is one, which is rare because most of these anomalies aren't really discussed in mainstream scientific literature, tends to involve mineral deposits, unusual geological formations, or meteorite impacts. The Wilkes Land anomaly, for example, has been attributed to a massive asteroid impact crater buried under the ice, which is possible. Asteroids do occasionally hit planets. It's kind of their thing. And a large enough impact would definitely leave a significant magnetic signature. But here's the thing about impact craters. They have specific characteristics. The magnetic signature should be circular or roughly circular, with a specific pattern radiating from the impact point. Some of these Antarctic anomalies don't fit that pattern. They're too linear, too organized, too structured. It's like the difference between throwing a rock into water and watching random ripples spread out, versus looking at carefully arranged geometric patterns. One is natural chaos. The other suggests design. Military and civilian pilots who regularly fly over Antarctica have reported something even stranger. No-fly zones. Not official restricted airspace marked on charts because of political reasons or military exercises. I'm talking about areas where pilots are strongly advised, sometimes ordered, not to fly because of instrument failures and navigation difficulties. Areas where even experienced aviators with state-of-the-art equipment suddenly find themselves unable to trust their instruments. Altimeters showing impossible readings. Artificial horizons tilting when the plane is level. Radio communications cutting out completely. And in some reports, which admittedly fall more into the anecdotal category but are worth mentioning because they come from trained observers, the atmosphere itself feels different. Electrically charged, like flying through an invisible field of static energy that makes your hair stand on end and gives you the distinct impression that something is fundamentally wrong with the physics of the space you're occupying. Which is not exactly the kind of experience that inspires confidence when you're piloting an aircraft over one of the most hostile environments on Earth with the nearest safe landing site several hundred miles away. The question becomes, what could cause this? Magnetic anomalies of this scale require something substantial. In conventional geology, we'd expect to find large mineral deposits, iron ore, magnetite, other ferromagnetic materials. And sure, there probably are mineral deposits under Antarctica. It's a continent. Continents have minerals. But the size and pattern of these anomalies suggest something beyond normal geological processes. The uniformity is wrong. The precision is off. It's like finding a perfectly square boulder, technically possible through natural processes, but statistically improbable enough that you'd be justified in at least considering the possibility that someone carved it into that shape. Now multiply that by a factor of several thousand, and you start to get an idea of what we're dealing with here. These aren't minor curiosities. These are major anomalies that, if they were located anywhere else on Earth, would have been exhaustively studied, drilled, and analyzed until we understood exactly what was causing them. But because they're in Antarctica, under miles of ice, in one of the most expensive and logistically challenging environments to work in, they remain largely unexplored and definitely unexplained. So let's entertain a hypothesis that sounds completely insane until you really think about it. What if these electromagnetic anomalies are remnants of an ancient technological network? What if there was a civilization that understood and utilized planetary magnetic and electrical fields in ways we're only beginning to comprehend? We know Earth has a magnetic field. We know it has natural electrical currents running through the ground and atmosphere. We use these phenomena for navigation, communication, and in recent years, we've started exploring ways to harness geomagnetic energy. But what if an ancient civilization was way ahead of us on this? What if they built a network of structures designed to tap into and redistribute planetary energy? Think of it like a power grid, except instead of burning coal or splitting atoms, they're using the Earth itself as a generator. The magnetic anomalies we're detecting could be the remains of this system. Massive conductors, capacitors, or resonance chambers built from materials specifically chosen for their electromagnetic properties. Structures designed to channel energy across vast distances, without wires, without fuel, using principles of physics that we're still trying to fully understand. It sounds like science fiction. I'll grant you that. But so did wireless electricity until Nikola Tesla started playing with resonant frequency transmission, and we're still playing catch-up with some of his ideas over a century later. Now let's shift gears and talk about something that's somehow even weirder than magnetic anomalies: lakes. Specifically, lakes under miles of ice that shouldn't exist, containing liquid water that definitely shouldn't exist at those temperatures, supporting life forms that absolutely shouldn't exist in those conditions. Welcome to the wonderful world of Antarctic subglacial lakes, where everything you learned in basic physics class goes to die of hypothermia and confusion. Lake Vostok is the poster child for this phenomenon. This is not a small pond. This is not a puddle. This is a lake the size of Lake Ontario, one of the Great Lakes, for reference, sitting beneath roughly 2.5 miles of solid ice. It's approximately 160 miles long and 30 miles wide at its widest point. That's enough water to fill a truly ridiculous number of Olympic swimming pools. Though I'm not going to do the math because, honestly, at this scale, the comparison becomes meaningless. The point is, it's huge, and it's been sealed under that ice, completely isolated from the surface environment, for an estimated 15 to 25 million years. Let me put that timeline in perspective. When this lake was last exposed to sunlight and atmospheric conditions, there were no humans. There were no hominids. There were barely any recognizable mammals. The continents were still actively rearranging themselves into their current configuration. This lake has been cut off from the rest of the world since before most of modern Earth species evolved. It's a time capsule, a sealed biosphere, a completely isolated ecosystem that's been doing its own thing without any external input for longer than human civilization has existed by several orders of magnitude. Now here's where it gets thermodynamically interesting, which is science speak, for this violates our expectations in ways that demand explanation. Water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius at standard atmospheric pressure. That's basic physics. That's why your ice cubes are solid. But Lake Vostok contains liquid water at temperatures around -3 degrees Celsius, -3, below freezing. And yet, it's not frozen. Why? Well, the official explanation is pressure. When you have 2.5 miles of ice sitting on top of you, the pressure at the bottom is enormous. And increased pressure lowers the freezing point of water, which is why ice skates work. The pressure from your weight on the blade briefly melts the ice beneath you, creating a thin film of water that lets you glide. So technically, yes, pressure can explain liquid water below 0 degrees. But here's the thing. The pressure at the depth of Lake Vostok should lower the freezing point by maybe a degree or two. Not enough to explain liquid water at -3 degrees. So where's the extra energy coming from? The standard explanation is geothermal heat. Heat from Earth's interior radiating upward and keeping the lake from freezing. Which is plausible. Earth's core is hot. Heat rises. But the amount of geothermal activity required to maintain a lake of this size at temperatures above freezing, under miles of ice, in Antarctica of all places, suggests a significant heat source. A really significant heat source. One that conventional geology has a hard time fully accounting for without resorting to some creative interpretations of thermal dynamics and mantle convection patterns. In 2012, Russian researchers accomplished something absolutely remarkable and slightly terrifying. They drilled through 2.5 miles of ice and reached Lake Vostok. This took decades of planning and drilling, involved numerous technical challenges and setbacks, and was done with extreme caution because nobody wanted to contaminate this pristine, ancient ecosystem with modern bacteria and pollutants. When they finally broke through and collected water samples, they found something that shouldn't have been possible. Life. Not just traces of ancient preserved life. Active, living microorganisms. Bacteria and other microscopic life forms happily existing in water that's been sealed off from the rest of the planet for millions of years, in near freezing temperatures, in complete darkness, with no access to photosynthesis or surface nutrients. These organisms had somehow survived and evolved in complete isolation, developing in an environment so extreme and so cut off from the rest of Earth's biosphere that it's basically alien. scientists lost their minds, in a good way. Because if life can exist in these conditions, it dramatically expands the possibilities for where else life might exist. On icy moons in our solar system, on exoplanets with subsurface oceans, in environments we previously assumed were too hostile for biology. But here's where it gets even weirder. Some of the organisms discovered in Lake Vostok samples don't match anything in existing genetic databases. They're novel. They're unique. They're forms of life that evolved in complete isolation and developed characteristics we've never seen before, which is exactly what you'd expect from a sealed ecosystem that's been doing its own evolutionary thing for millions of years. Except there's another possibility that's worth considering, even if it sounds completely absurd. What if these organisms aren't entirely natural? What if they're remnants of a bioengineered ecosystem designed to survive in exactly these conditions? What if Lake Vostok, and potentially other subglacial lakes, aren't just random geological features, but were deliberately created or modified to serve as refuges, sealed biospheres designed to preserve life through a catastrophic climate change event? I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the plot of a B-movie where scientists discover a secret underground facility built by ancient aliens. But stay with me here. Lake Vostok isn't alone. Over 400 subglacial lakes have been identified across Antarctica using ice-penetrating radar and satellite data. 400. That's not a handful of anomalous features. That's a network. And here's what makes it really interesting. Many of these lakes appear to be connected by subterranean rivers and channels. They form a vast, hidden hydrological system beneath the ice. A network of waterways flowing through tunnels and passages under the Antarctic ice sheet. Some of these underground rivers are hundreds of miles long, connecting distant lakes in what appears to be a coordinated drainage system. Now, can this be explained naturally? Sure. Water flows downhill. It carves channels. It pools in depressions. This is basic hydrology. But the scale and organization of this network is unusual. The distribution of the lakes follows patterns that some researchers have noted seem almost too convenient, too regularly spaced, too well connected. It's like looking at a river system from above and noticing that the tributaries all meet at right angles and the spacing between water bodies is suspiciously uniform. Could be natural. Could also be engineered. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine you're an advanced civilization living in Antarctica, back when it was still temperate and habitable. You've got cities, technology, infrastructure. Then the climate starts changing. The ice age is coming. Temperatures are dropping. Your comfortable homeland is about to become the most inhospitable place on the planet. What do? Option 1. You leave. You migrate to warmer regions. You abandon everything and start over. Option 2. You try to adapt. You build underground. You create sealed environments that can maintain livable conditions even as the surface freezes over. You engineer a network of subterranean water systems that can preserve life, maintain temperature through geothermal energy, and serve as refuges until the climate improves. You build this system to last not just centuries, but millennia, maybe millions of years. You make it self-sustaining. And then, eventually, when the ice becomes too much and maintenance becomes impossible, you either leave or die out. But the system you built remains, slowly degrading, slowly failing, but still functional on some level. Still keeping water liquid, still generating heat, still maintaining isolated pockets of life in sealed ecosystems beneath the ice. Millions of years later, when a new civilization develops and finally has the technology to look beneath the ice, what they find is a network of lakes that seem to defy conventional thermodynamic expectations, supporting life that shouldn't exist, connected by channels that form suspiciously regular patterns. Crazy theory? Absolutely. Impossible. Well, that depends on whether you think ancient civilizations were capable of engineering on this scale. The geothermal anomalies are particularly interesting. We know Earth generates internal heat. We know this heat radiates upward. We know certain areas have more geothermal activity than others due to volcanic activity, mantle plumes, or thin crustal zones. But Antarctica isn't known for being a hotbed of volcanic activity. There are a few volcanoes, sure. Mount Erebus is the most famous, and it's actually one of the few places on Earth with a permanent lava lake in its summit crater, which is both cool and slightly concerning. But the distribution of geothermal heat necessary to maintain 400-plus subglacial lakes doesn't correlate perfectly with known volcanic zones. The heat sources seem more distributed, more diffuse, more consistent across the continent than you'd expect from purely natural volcanic activity, which raises the possibility, and I want to be clear, this is speculation, not established fact, that some of these heat sources might not be entirely natural. They might be remnants of a thermal management system. Think about it. If you wanted to keep water from freezing in a hostile environment, you'd need consistent heat distribution. You'd need thermal generators or heat exchangers spread across a wide area, working together to maintain temperature. The technology to do this exists today. We use geothermal heat pumps, thermal storage systems, and heat distribution networks in modern infrastructure. Scale that up to a continental level, add a few million years of degradation and failure, and what you'd be left with is exactly what we're observing. Sporadic heat sources keeping isolated water bodies from freezing, no longer functioning as a coordinated system, but still generating enough residual energy to maintain liquid water in specific locations. The electromagnetic anomalies and the subglacial lakes might not be separate phenomena at all. They might be parts of the same ancient infrastructure. Electromagnetic technology requires power, lots of power. Where would you get that power in a pre-industrial civilization? From the planet itself. Geothermal energy, magnetic field manipulation, piezoelectric crystals in bedrock responding to tectonic pressure. These are all potential energy sources that don't require burning fuel or splitting atoms. An ancient civilization with sufficient understanding of physics could theoretically tap into these natural processes and amplify them, creating a self-sustaining power network that persists long after the civilization itself disappeared. The magnetic anomalies could be the generators or power distribution nodes. The geothermal heat keeping the lakes liquid could be waste heat from this system, or intentional thermal management, or both. And the entire network of subglacial lakes and underground rivers could be the remains of a continent-wide infrastructure project designed to preserve life and maintain habitability in the face of an encroaching ice age that would eventually bury everything under miles of frozen water. Now, I want to be absolutely clear. I'm not claiming this is definitely what happened. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive. The anomalies are real. The magnetic signatures, the subglacial lakes, the impossible temperatures, the life forms that shouldn't exist. Those are documented facts. The interpretation of what caused these anomalies is where speculation comes in. Conventional science offers explanations. Mineral deposits, geothermal activity, unique geological formations, isolated evolution. And those explanations work, mostly, if you're willing to accept a lot of coincidences and unusual circumstances all happening in the same place. The alternative interpretation, that these are remnants of ancient technology and engineered systems, requires accepting that a sophisticated civilization existed in Antarctica before the Ice Age and had capabilities we're only beginning to match. Both explanations strain credibility in different ways. The question is, which one strains credibility less? Which explanation requires fewer unlikely coincidences? Which narrative actually fits the evidence better when you look at all of it together instead of trying to explain each anomaly in isolation? Because here's the thing about science. It's supposed to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if that leads to uncomfortable or paradigm-shifting conclusions. When you have multiple independent lines of evidence all pointing toward the same conclusion, ancient maps showing pre-ice geography, geometric structures under the ice, electromagnetic anomalies consistent with large artificial objects, subglacial, lakes that maintain impossible temperatures, life forms surviving in sealed environments for millions of years. At some point, you have to at least consider the possibility that conventional explanations aren't sufficient. You have to be willing to entertain alternative hypotheses, no matter how strange they sound. And you have to be willing to investigate thoroughly instead of dismissing evidence because it doesn't fit the accepted narrative, which, unfortunately, hasn't been happening as much as it should. Antarctica remains one of the least explored regions on Earth, partially because of logistics and cost, but possibly also because of institutional resistance to findings that might require rewriting the textbooks. Nobody likes admitting they've been wrong about something fundamental, especially when careers, reputations, and entire fields of study are built on current paradigms. So we're left with questions. Big questions. Questions about what's really under that ice and why it's generating effects that challenge our understanding of natural processes. Questions about whether the planet itself is trying to reveal something we've been ignoring or suppressing. Questions about what happens when those lakes are eventually exposed as the ice continues to melt. When we can finally send expeditions to study them up close instead of relying on limited drill samples and remote sensing data. Questions about what we'll do with the information if it confirms that something extraordinary is down there, something that doesn't fit into our comfortable narrative about human history and technological development. Will we acknowledge it? Will we study it honestly? Or will we find ways to explain it away? To maintain our assumptions about being the first and only advanced civilization this planet has produced? Time will tell. The ice is melting. The truth, whatever it is, won't stay buried forever. And honestly, I'm not sure whether I'm more excited or terrified about what we're going to find when it finally surfaces. All right, so we've established that Antarctica has impossible maps, magnetic chaos that makes compasses lose their minds, and lakes that refuse to freeze despite being under miles of ice in the coldest place on Earth. But wait. There's more. Because apparently, Antarctica decided that wasn't weird enough and threw in some architecture that would make ancient civilizations experts question their entire careers. I'm talking about geometric structures so precise, so deliberately designed, that calling them natural formations would be like looking at the Parthenon and saying, yeah, that's just erosion patterns in some rocks. We're talking about buildings. Or at least, things that look suspiciously like buildings, protruding from the ice in certain locations, with geometric precision that would make a mathematician weep tears of joy or terror, depending on their tolerance for paradigm shifts. Let's start with what's been reported by various personnel who've spent time in Antarctica. And before anyone jumps in with, oh, these are just stories, remember that eyewitness testimony from trained observers who have no reason to fabricate. Elaborate hoaxes is actually a valid form of evidence, especially when multiple independent witnesses describe similar phenomena. Reports have surfaced describing octagonal structures, 8-sided geometric formations with walls that rise from the ice, like someone buried a massive building and only the top few floors are visible. We're talking about walls that stand roughly 18 feet high above the ice surface, which suggests whatever these structures are, they extend much deeper below. These aren't subtle features you'd easily miss. These are prominent architectural elements. Clearly defined edges, obvious geometric precision. It's like someone constructed a building, then nature decided to bury it in a few thousand years' worth of snow and ice. And now we're finally seeing the roof poking through as the ice recedes. Except the few thousand years might need a few extra zeros on the end. Now here's where it gets properly science fiction. These structures reportedly have entrances, doorways, and not your standard crack between rocks that you can squeeze through if you're brave and/or stupid kind of entrance. I'm talking about proper architectural doors, massive things, reportedly around 30 feet thick, which, for context, is about as thick as the walls of a nuclear bunker, suggesting these structures were built to withstand either extreme conditions or were meant to last an absolutely absurd amount of time. And here's the kicker that makes absolutely no sense from an engineering standpoint. These doors, despite being massive and presumably weighing tons, can apparently be opened with minimal force. Like one finger touching the right spot and the door swings open, kind of minimal force, which is the architectural equivalent of finding a medieval castle with automatic sliding doors. It doesn't compute. Massive stone or metal doors don't work like that. They require significant force to move, unless they're mounted on some kind of extremely sophisticated bearing system with perfect balance and near frictionless hinges. The kind of engineering that, quite frankly, would be impressive today and should be impossible in any ancient civilization, regardless of how advanced they supposedly were. But wait, it gets better. Or weirder. Take your pick. Reports indicate that inside these structures, the temperature remains stable at around 20 to 22 degrees Celsius. That's roughly 70 degrees Fahrenheit for my American friends. Room temperature. Comfortable human habitation temperature in Antarctica, where the outside temperature can drop to -50 or worse, without any visible heating system, no furnaces, no heating vents, no geothermal pipes, no electricity, nothing. Just walls that somehow maintain a comfortable temperature differential of over 100 degrees from the external environment. Now, insulation can explain some of this. A well-insulated building retains heat, but insulation doesn't generate heat. It just slows down heat transfer. For a structure to maintain room temperature in Antarctica without active heating, it would need either an internal heat source we can't detect, or insulation properties that exceed anything we can currently manufacture, or both. It's like finding an igloo in the Sahara that somehow stays frozen inside without refrigeration. The thermodynamics don't work. Unless the materials used in construction have properties we don't understand, or there's some kind of passive thermal regulation system built into the structure itself that's still functioning after thousands or millions of years. And if that wasn't sufficiently bizarre, there's the glow. Multiple reports mention that the interior walls of these structures emit a faint greenish luminescence. Not bright enough to light up a room like a fluorescent bulb, but enough to be noticeable, especially in the perpetual darkness of Antarctic winter. A lime green glow of completely unknown origin. It's not bioluminescence. There are no organisms visible on the walls. It's not phosphorescence from absorbed light. These structures are under or within ice, with no light source to absorb. It's not radioactive decay causing scintillation. Radiation detectors would pick that up, and presumably someone would have mentioned if these structures were radioactive enough to glow. So what is it? Chemiluminescence from materials in the walls? Some kind of crystalline structure that generates light through piezoelectric effects from seismic pressure? An extremely slow-acting chemical reaction that's been running for millennia? Or, and this is where we venture into territory that sounds like pure speculation, but honestly isn't any more implausible than the conventional attempts at explanation. Some kind of embedded technology that's still operational, still drawing power from somewhere, still functioning according to its original design parameters, even after its builders are long gone. Because that's the thing about really good engineering. It lasts. Roman aqueducts still work. Ancient drainage systems still drain. If you build something well enough, with the right materials and the right design, it can continue functioning for timescales that seem impossible. Now scale that up to a civilization that might have been as far beyond the Romans as we are beyond medieval craftsmen. And suddenly, multi-millennial functionality doesn't seem quite so impossible. The walls of these structures also reportedly feature inscriptions, symbols, characters, what appear to be some form of writing or notation. And here's the thing. They don't match any known writing system. Not ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, not Sumerian cuneiform, not ancient Chinese, not Sanskrit, not Phoenician, not any of the writing systems we've cataloged from ancient civilizations around the world. They're completely unique, which either means this is a writing system that predates all known written language, making it potentially the oldest writing system ever discovered, or it belongs to a civilization that developed independently and left no descendants or cultural connections to any of the civilizations we know about. Both options are paradigm-shattering in different ways. If it's older than all known writing, we need to push back our entire timeline of when humans developed written language by potentially thousands of years. If it's from an independent civilization that left no traces anywhere else, we need to accept that there was a sophisticated culture in Antarctica that arose, flourished, and disappeared without influencing any of the civilizations that came after. Both scenarios require massive revisions to our understanding of human cultural development. And unfortunately, for anyone hoping for easy answers, nobody's been able to translate these inscriptions yet. Without a Rosetta Stone equivalent, something that provides the same text in multiple languages, deciphering a completely unknown writing system is extraordinarily difficult. It can take decades of analysis, and that's when you have extensive samples to work with. When your samples consist of inscriptions inside structures buried under Antarctic ice that very few people have access to, progress is going to be slow at best. Now, here's where the architectural analysis gets really interesting. Octagonal geometry. 8 sides. It's not the most common architectural choice throughout history, but it's not unknown either. And when you start looking at ancient and medieval structures around the world, you find octagons showing up in some very significant buildings. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, one of the oldest works of Islamic architecture still standing, is built on an octagonal plan. Multiple Asian pagodas use octagonal structures. The Tower of the Winds in Athens, from the 1st century BC, is octagonal. Numerous baptistries in medieval Europe are octagonal. Castel del Monte in Italy, built in the 13th century, is a perfect octagon with octagonal towers at each corner. So clearly, the octagon as an architectural form has some appeal across different cultures and time periods. But here's the thing. Why? What's so special about 8 sides? Why would different cultures, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, independently decide that octagons were the way to go for significant religious or civic structures? The standard explanation is that it's mathematically pleasing, it's structurally stable, it represents various symbolic meanings in different cultures, which is fine as far as it goes. But what if there's another explanation? What if the octagon shows up repeatedly because it's not an independent architectural innovation, but rather a remembered form, a template passed down from an older source, gradually degraded through cultural transmission, but still recognizable? What if there was a global civilization, or a network of civilizations with cultural contact, that used octagonal architecture as a signature style, and later cultures that arose in the same regions continued using this form without necessarily understanding why, just because That's how important buildings are supposed to look. The idea of a global ancient civilization with unified architectural principles sounds like alternative history fantasy until you actually look at the distribution of similar architectural features around the world. Pyramids show up in Egypt, Mexico, Central America, Sudan, China, and possibly Antarctica. Megalithic stone construction with precisely fitted massive blocks appears in Peru, Egypt, Easter Island, Japan, and numerous other locations. Octagonal and other specific geometric forms appear in structures separated by vast distances and supposedly independent cultural development. Either this is an absolutely remarkable series of coincidences where humans in different parts of the world independently invented the same solutions to architectural problems and happened to choose the same geometric forms for symbolic structures. Or there was some level of cultural connection, whether through direct contact, inherited knowledge from a common predecessor, or transmission of architectural knowledge through trade routes and cultural exchange that conventional history hasn't adequately documented. The conventional explanation requires believing in an extraordinary level of parallel development. The alternative explanation requires believing in a level of global connectivity in ancient times that exceeds what conventional archaeology accepts. Both options stretch credibility. The question is, which one stretches it less? Speaking of structures that challenge conventional archaeology, let's talk about pyramids. Because apparently, Antarctica couldn't just have octagonal mystery buildings. It also needed to throw in some pyramids for good measure. And I'm not talking about vaguely pyramid-shaped mountains that kind of look pointy if you squint at them from the right angle, while possibly suffering from mild altitude-induced hallucinations. I'm talking about formations that are so geometrically precise, so perfectly symmetrical, that the only way to dismiss them as natural features is to have an institutional commitment to not considering any alternative explanations, no matter what the evidence shows. In the Shackleton Range of Antarctica, there are 3 pyramidal structures that are visible even through the ice cover. Satellite imagery shows them clearly. They're not subtle. They're not ambiguous. They are pyramid-shaped. 3 sides visible, apex at the top. Geometric precision that makes them stand out dramatically from the surrounding mountain terrain. And here's what makes them particularly interesting. Their faces are aligned with the cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. This isn't approximate. This isn't generally oriented toward the cardinal points. This is precise alignment, accurate within a degree or less. The kind of alignment that requires deliberate surveying and intentional construction, not random geological processes that happen to produce a pyramid-shaped mountain that coincidentally points north. For comparison, the Great Pyramid of Giza is famous for its extremely precise cardinal alignment, oriented to within 3/60 of a single degree of true north. That level of precision in ancient Egypt is considered remarkable. Evidence of sophisticated surveying techniques and astronomical knowledge. The Antarctic pyramidal structures, if they are indeed artificial, would match or potentially exceed this level of precision, which would make them, at minimum, as sophisticated as the Egyptian pyramids in terms of planning and construction precision. And if they're covered by ice that's been accumulating for thousands or millions of years, they would be significantly older. But it's not just these 3. Satellite surveys have identified dozens of similar formations across Antarctica. Not hundreds, not thousands, but dozens of clearly pyramidal formations that stand out from the surrounding terrain, arranged in patterns that some researchers have noted seem almost too regular to be natural. They're not randomly scattered across the continent. They appear in clusters, with spacing between formations that shows surprising regularity. When you map them out, you get a pattern that looks less like random mountain peaks and more like deliberately positioned markers or nodes in a network. Now, is this definitive proof of artificial structures? No. It's possible these are natural mountain peaks that were shaped by geological processes into pyramid-like forms. It's possible the regular spacing is coincidental. It's possible the cardinal alignment is just luck. But when you have multiple examples all showing the same characteristics, pyramidal form, geometric precision, cardinal alignment, regular spacing, the coincidence explanation starts to require more faith than the alternative hypothesis that maybe, just maybe, these are artificial structures. Here's where it gets into pure speculative territory. But it's speculation based on observations that deserve consideration. Some researchers looking at the distribution of these Antarctic pyramids, along with pyramids and similar structures around the world, have proposed that they might be nodes in a global energy grid. The idea is that ancient civilizations understood principles of planetary energy that we're only beginning to rediscover. Concepts involving Earth's magnetic field, telluric currents, resonance phenomena, and possibly even manipulation of gravitational or quantum field effects that we don't yet fully understand. According to this hypothesis, pyramidal structures aren't just monuments or tombs. They're functional devices, built with specific geometric proportions and materials to resonate at certain frequencies and channel or amplify natural Earth energies. The global distribution would represent a network, with pyramids positioned at geomagnetically significant locations, working together as a planetary-scale power generation and distribution system. Which sounds completely insane until you remember that Nikola Tesla was working on wireless power transmission over a century ago. And modern physics has demonstrated numerous instances where geometric structure and material properties can affect electromagnetic fields, acoustic resonance, and quantum behavior in ways that would have seemed like magic to our ancestors. Acoustic studies of these Antarctic structures, to the extent such studies have been possible given the logistical challenges and access restrictions, have shown something intriguing. They resonate when subjected to seismic waves or other vibrational inputs. They respond at specific frequencies. This isn't particularly unusual. All structures resonate at some frequency. It's basic physics. But the specific frequencies and the resonance patterns are unusual enough that they've caught the attention of researchers who study how ancient structures interact with sound. Similar studies of the pyramids in Egypt, Central American pyramids, and megalithic structures like Stonehenge have shown that these structures resonate at frequencies that don't seem accidental. Some resonate at frequencies that match human speech, others at infrasound frequencies below human hearing, others at frequencies that correspond to specific musical notes or mathematical ratios. The conventional explanation is that these are interesting acoustic properties that might have played a role in rituals or religious ceremonies. The alternative explanation is that these resonance properties were part of the design specification, that these structures were built to resonate at specific frequencies because that resonance was functionally important, perhaps for energy, generation, signal transmission, or other purposes we don't yet fully understand because our physics education doesn't typically include courses on how to build planetary-scale resonance chambers for purposes of geomagnetic energy manipulation. The function of these structures, if they are indeed artificial and not just really conveniently pyramid-shaped mountains, remains speculative. But the wireless energy transmission hypothesis isn't actually as crazy as it sounds. Tesla demonstrated the principles. Modern research into wireless power transfer has shown it's possible over limited distances. The question is whether these principles can be scaled up to planetary dimensions using natural resonance phenomena and geometric amplification. A pyramid is essentially a giant antenna, a geometric form that naturally focuses and directs electromagnetic energy. Place pyramids at specific locations where Earth's magnetic field lines or telluric current channels intersect. Build them with precise geometric proportions to resonate at frequencies that matched natural planetary oscillations, and theoretically, and I want to emphasize this is theoretical because nobody has actually tested it at this scale. You could create a network that generates and distributes energy wirelessly using the planet itself as the power source. It would be the ultimate renewable energy system. No fuel required, no moving parts to wear out, no pollution, just geometric structures working in resonance with natural planetary energy fields. And if you built it well enough, with the right materials and the right understanding of the physics involved, it could continue functioning for timescales measured in millennia, until, say, a major climate change event buries half your network under miles of ice and breaks the resonance patterns that made the whole system work, at which point the energy grid fails. The civilization that depended on it collapses, and thousands of years later, someone discovers the remnants and can't figure out what the hell they were looking at because the technology is so far outside their frame of reference that it might as well be alien. Now, connecting all of this, the octagonal structures with their thermal regulation and mysterious glowing walls, the pyramids aligned to cardinal directions and resonating at specific frequencies, the global distribution of similar architectural forms, the electromagnetic anomalies and subglacial lakes we discussed earlier, a pattern emerges. It's not a neat pattern. It's not conclusive. But it suggests a level of ancient technological sophistication that conventional archaeology isn't comfortable acknowledging. It suggests structures built with knowledge of physics, engineering, and planetary systems that equals or exceeds our current capabilities in some respects. It suggests a civilization that thought on global scales, that built infrastructure designed to last for geological timeframes, that understood principles we're only now beginning to rediscover. And it suggests that Antarctica, currently the most hostile and least inhabited continent on Earth, might have once been a hub of this civilization, a center of technological development now buried under ice, preserved like a time capsule waiting for the climate to change enough that we can finally see what's been hidden down there all along. The implications are staggering if even a fraction of this is accurate. It means our species has done this before. We've built advanced civilizations, developed sophisticated technology, created global infrastructure networks. And then something happened. Catastrophic climate change, cosmic impact, technological failure, societal collapse, we don't know. And it all came apart. The knowledge was lost. The structures were buried or destroyed. And the survivors, if there were survivors, had to start over from scratch, building new civilizations that had no memory of what came before, except in myths and legends that got progressively more distorted over generations until they became stories about gods and heroes rather than historical accounts of actual advanced civilizations. We became archaeologically illiterate about our own past, rediscovering stone tools and agriculture and writing as if we'd never done it before, when in fact we might be reinventing technologies that our ancestors had already mastered and then lost. It's a humbling thought. It suggests that progress isn't linear. It suggests that advancement isn't guaranteed. It suggests that everything we've built, everything we've achieved, could be lost just as completely if we're not careful. And it suggests that Antarctica, that frozen continent we've mostly ignored except for scientific research, might hold the key to understanding who we really are, where we really came from, and what we're really capable of as a species when we're not too busy fighting each other to actually work together on a planetary scale. But we'll only know for sure when we can finally access these structures properly, study them thoroughly, and have the honesty to acknowledge what the evidence shows instead of dismissing it because it contradicts our comfortable assumptions about human history. And at the rate the ice is melting, that day might come sooner than we think. So we've covered ancient maps, magnetic chaos, impossible lakes, glowing octagonal buildings, and pyramids that might be nodes in a planetary energy grid. At this point, you're probably thinking, okay, this is interesting, but it's all ancient history and geological anomalies. Surely nothing weird has happened in Antarctica in modern times, right? Wrong. Spectacularly, documentedly, government file level wrong. Because in the immediate aftermath of World War II, when the world was still cleaning up the mess from the most devastating conflict in human history, the United States decided the absolute top priority, more urgent than rebuilding Europe, more important than addressing post-war tensions with the Soviet Union, was to send the largest military expedition in Antarctic history to the frozen continent. And then, mysteriously, cut the mission short and never properly explain what happened. Which is the geopolitical equivalent of frantically driving to someone's house at 3 a.m., banging on the door for 5 minutes, then suddenly sprinting back to your car and speeding away without explanation. Normal behavior from a superpower nation, clearly. Let me set the stage here. It's 1946. World War II ended in 1945. The world is exhausted. Millions are dead. Economies are shattered. Cities are rubble. This is not the time when you'd expect a major military power to say, "You know what we need right now? A massive expedition to Antarctica. Let's throw significant resources at the bottom of the world for reasons that will definitely make sense to taxpayers." But that's exactly what happened. The operation was called Operation High Jump, which is either a reference to Antarctica's high elevation or someone in the naming department had a sense of humor about sending people to jump off a ship into the coldest ocean on Earth. The expedition was led by Admiral Richard Byrd, who was already famous for his polar explorations. He'd flown over the North Pole in 1926 and over the South Pole in 1929, so he knew what he was getting into. This wasn't some rookie explorer wandering into the unknown. This was a seasoned veteran with extensive polar experience, leading what would become the most heavily equipped Antarctic expedition ever mounted. And when I say heavily equipped, I'm not talking about a couple of ships and some enthusiastic scientists with notebooks. I'm talking about 13 ships. 13. That's a small fleet. We're talking about 33 aircraft, including seaplanes, helicopters, and flying boats. We're talking about 4,700 personnel, military personnel, scientists, equipment operators, support staff. For context, that's roughly the population of a small town, except this town is mobile and heading to Antarctica. This is not a research mission. This is not a casual scientific survey. This is a military operation on a scale that would be impressive in peacetime, and is absolutely bizarre for a nation that just finished fighting a two-front global war and is presumably focused on domestic concerns like, transitioning back to a peacetime economy and dealing with the hundreds of other pressing issues facing a post-war superpower. But no, Antarctica. Top priority, obviously. The official mission statement was mapping and surveying, looking for potential sites for military bases, testing equipment in extreme cold conditions, establishing territorial claims, basic research stuff. Which makes sense on paper. The Cold War was just beginning. The United States and Soviet Union were eyeing each other suspiciously. Claiming Antarctic territory and establishing a military presence could be strategically important. Except here's the thing. The mission was scheduled to last 6 to 8 months. That's a substantial commitment of resources and personnel for a mapping mission. You pack for 8 months in Antarctica, you're bringing serious supplies, serious equipment, serious logistics support. This was planned as a comprehensive, long-term operation. They weren't planning a quick survey. They were planning to stay, to explore extensively, to achieve significant objectives that would justify the enormous expense and logistical complexity of keeping nearly 5,000 people supplied and operational at the bottom of the world during the Antarctic summer season. And then, mysteriously, the entire operation ended after just 8 weeks. 2 months. Less than a quarter of the planned duration. The fleet packed up and went home, returning in February 1947, months earlier than scheduled. The official explanation was, and I'm being generous by calling this an explanation rather than a dismissive handwave, that they accomplished their objectives ahead of schedule and faced difficult ice conditions, which is the military equivalent of saying, "Oh yeah, we totally meant to leave early. Everything went exactly as planned. Nothing to see here." Except everything about this screams that something went wrong. You don't plan an 8-month expedition, spend enormous amounts of money and resources getting everyone there, and then suddenly leave after 2 months because we finished early. That's not how large-scale military operations work. You don't over-budget by 6 months on a mapping mission. You don't bring 4,700 people and 13 ships for a task that apparently only required 8 weeks. Something happened. Something significant enough that the decision was made to abort the mission and get everyone out of there as quickly as possible. Now, here's where it gets into territory that ranges from interesting anomaly to what the actual hell. Various personnel from the expedition, and we're talking about people who were actually there, not random conspiracy theorists making things up. Decades later, reported unusual encounters. Specifically, encounters with unidentified flying objects. And before anyone rolls their eyes and dismisses this as UFO nonsense, remember that unidentified flying object just means something flying that we couldn't identify. Not necessarily alien spacecraft. Although given everything else we've discussed about Antarctica, I'm not ruling anything out at this point. Reports describe objects rising from the ocean near the fleet. Objects moving at speeds that shouldn't be possible with 1940s technology or, frankly, with current technology. Objects that engaged in what witnesses described as hostile or at least aggressive maneuvers toward the expedition's aircraft and ships. We're talking about objects that could accelerate from stationary to extreme velocities in seconds, could change direction instantaneously without slowing down, could outmaneuver military aircraft that were, at the time, among the fastest and most advanced in the world. This is not weather balloons. This is not ice crystals creating optical illusions. This is experienced military personnel, pilots, sailors, officers, reporting objects demonstrating flight capabilities that exceeded anything in the known arsenal of any nation on Earth. Admiral Byrd himself, upon returning to the United States, gave an interview in March 1947. And this is where things get properly weird because what he said in this interview is not what you'd expect from a military officer giving a routine post-mission debrief. He stated, and this is documented in multiple sources, though the original interview records have become frustratingly difficult to find in complete form, that the United States needed to prepare for the possibility of an enemy capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds. He mentioned threats that could come from beyond the poles. He indicated that the greatest danger now facing the United States came from objects that could fly over both poles. This is not standard post-expedition commentary. This is not, "We had a successful mapping mission and collected valuable data." This is, "We encountered something that represents a potential threat to national security, and I'm obliquely trying to warn people about it without explicitly saying what we found." And the phrasing is deliberate. From beyond the poles doesn't mean from other countries. It means from or through the polar regions, suggesting that whatever they encountered either originated in Antarctica or was using Antarctica as some kind of operational base. And here's the kicker. Shortly after this interview, Admiral Byrd was essentially silenced. He gave no more interviews about the expedition. He made no further public statements about what they'd encountered. Various sources claim he was placed under strict orders not to discuss the mission details, some even claiming he was effectively under house arrest, confined to his property and monitored to ensure he didn't speak publicly about what happened. Now, whether the house arrest part is true or embellished is debatable. But what's not debatable is that a decorated admiral who had just led the largest Antarctic expedition in history suddenly went quiet about his experiences and remained quiet for the rest of his life. That's not normal. That's suppression. That's a clear indication that whatever happened down there, the official policy was to keep it out of public discussion. And when governments go out of their way to suppress information, it usually means the information is either embarrassing, sensitive, or reveals something they really don't want people thinking about too hard. So what did they encounter? What was significant enough to cause an early termination of a massive expedition and warrant shutting down all discussion of the actual events? The conventional skeptical explanation is that nothing unusual happened. People misidentified natural phenomena or conventional aircraft, and the early departure was due to boring logistical reasons. But that explanation requires ignoring a lot of documented testimony from credible witnesses, dismissing Admiral Byrd's own statements as either fabricated or misunderstood, and accepting that a meticulously planned 8-month mission just happened, to finish 6 months early for completely mundane reasons. The alternative explanation, that they encountered something they couldn't explain, something that demonstrated technological capabilities beyond what any nation possessed at the time, something that was either stationed in or emerging from Antarctica, fits the evidence better. It explains the rushed departure. It explains Byrd's warnings about threats from the poles. It explains the subsequent suppression of information about the mission. It doesn't necessarily explain what they encountered, but it acknowledges that they encountered something. Now, let's rewind a few years and talk about why the United States might have been particularly interested in Antarctica in 1946. Because there's a connection here that's often overlooked, but becomes really interesting when you consider the timeline. During World War II, specifically in 1938 and 1939, Nazi Germany launched its own Antarctic expedition called the German Antarctic Expedition, though it's more commonly known by its ship name, Neuschwabenland. This wasn't a casual scientific cruise. This was a systematic mapping and claiming operation covering roughly 600,000 square kilometers of Antarctic territory, an area larger than France. They flew multiple aerial survey missions, photographed vast stretches of the coastline and interior regions, and dropped thousands of metal swastika markers across the territory they were claiming for the Third Reich. Because apparently, when you're a fascist regime bent on world domination, you need to make sure even Antarctica knows who's in charge. The symbolism is cartoonishly evil, but the operation itself was professionally executed and clearly had serious strategic objectives beyond just planting flags. The interesting thing about the Neuschwabenland expedition is what they were photographing and mapping. Reports and surviving documentation indicate they were particularly interested in areas with ice-free regions, places where geothermal activity kept certain valleys, caves, and lakes free from ice despite the Antarctic cold. These aren't common, but they exist. Thermal springs, volcanic activity, and other geological features can create pockets of relative warmth where liquid water exists and where, theoretically, you could establish a base without having to constantly battle ice buildup. The expedition documented several of these areas, took detailed photographs, and made extensive notes about their locations and characteristics. Why would Nazi Germany care about ice-free caves in Antarctica in 1939? Well, if you're planning for the long-term possibility that your 1,000-year Reich might face some setbacks, Or if you're looking for secure locations to conduct research away from Allied observation, remote caves in Antarctica that are naturally warmed and hidden under ice make a lot of sense. They're about as far from enemy forces as you can get on Earth. They're virtually impossible to find without precise coordinates, and they offer natural environmental conditions that make them actually habitable with minimal infrastructure. After the war ended in 1945, various testimonies emerged. Some from interrogated U-boat crew members, some from intelligence reports, some from declassified documents, mentioning a secret Nazi base in Antarctica. This base, variously called Base 211 or New Swabia Station depending on the source, was allegedly established in one of these ice-free thermal cave systems. The claims suggest that toward the end of the war, when it became clear Germany was losing, certain Nazi personnel, equipment, and potentially experimental technology were evacuated to this Antarctic base. Submarines would have been the ideal transport method. They can travel submerged and avoid detection. They have the range to reach Antarctica from European waters, and they can surface in remote locations to offload cargo without being observed. And here's where it gets interesting. Argentine newspapers from 1945 through 1947 reported multiple sightings and rumors of German U-boats arriving at the coast of Patagonia, the southern tip of South America, the closest landmass to Antarctica. Some reports mentioned submarines delivering cargo or personnel that were then being transported further south. Some reports mentioned U-boat crew members surrendering to Argentine authorities weeks or even months after the war officially ended. This isn't wild speculation. There are newspaper records, naval reports, and documented instances of U-boats showing up in South American waters well after Germany's surrender. Now, did the Nazis actually establish a permanent base in Antarctica? Did they evacuate significant technology or personnel there in the final days of the war? The evidence is circumstantial and fragmentary, which is exactly what you'd expect for a secret operation conducted by a collapsing regime. We know they sent an expedition there. We know they mapped suitable locations for bases. We know U-boats were active in southern waters after the war. We know there were reports of submarine activity in the region. What we don't have is definitive proof of a base, because if such a base existed, it was secret then, and it's either still secret or has been thoroughly erased from the historical record. But here's the thing. If you're the United States in 1946, and you've been hearing intelligence reports and rumors about Nazi remnants in Antarctica, and you've got former German officers claiming during interrogations that there's a secret base down there with experimental technology, you're going to want to check that out. You're going to want to make sure there isn't a pocket of the Third Reich still operational at the South Pole, potentially with access to the advanced weapons research the Nazis were working on at the end of the war. That would absolutely justify sending a massive military expedition. That would explain the scale and urgency of Operation High Jump. You're not just mapping territory. You're conducting a search and potentially a military operation against holdouts from a war that supposedly ended a year earlier. So here's a possible timeline that connects all of this. The Nazis explore Antarctica in 1938 to 39 and discover something significant. Whether it's the ice-free caves suitable for bases, or something more unusual like the structures and anomalies we've been discussing in previous chapters. They establish some kind of presence there, possibly evacuate personnel and equipment in 1945 as the war ends. The United States gets intelligence about this and launches Operation High Jump in 1946 to investigate, secure the area, and eliminate any Nazi presence. The expedition encounters something unexpected, whether it's more extensive Nazi facilities than anticipated, or they discover what the Nazis were interested in down there, or they encounter something neither side fully understood. They're forced to retreat after 8 weeks, Admiral Byrd tries to communicate the significance of what they found in oblique terms that won't violate his security clearance, but will at least hint at the threat. He gets shut down. The whole affair gets classified. And for the next several decades, Antarctica remains one of the most tightly controlled territories on Earth, with access strictly regulated through international treaty and any significant findings kept carefully out of public discussion. The connection between the Nazi interest in Antarctica and the American expedition that followed is too convenient to be coincidental. The timing is suspicious. The scale of Operation High Jump is excessive for a simple mapping mission, but appropriate for a military search operation. The abrupt termination and subsequent information suppression suggests they found something significant that warranted keeping it classified. And the testimony from personnel involved, though fragmentary and often suppressed, consistently indicates encounters with something unusual. Whether advanced technology, unknown facilities, or phenomena that couldn't be easily explained. When you combine this with everything else we've discussed, the structures under the ice, the electromagnetic anomalies, the impossible thermal properties of certain regions, a picture emerges of Antarctica as something far more significant than a frozen wasteland. It becomes a location of strategic importance, possibly because of what's naturally there, possibly because of what was built there in the past, or possibly because of what various modern powers have attempted to do there. Either way, the official story of Operation High Jump, that it was a routine mapping mission that accomplished its goals ahead of schedule, is about as believable as claiming you accidentally spent your entire life savings on lottery tickets and won by pure luck. Sure, it's technically possible, but the circumstances suggest a much more complex story than the one we're being told. The Nazi connection also raises an interesting question. What if the Third Reich's interest in Antarctica wasn't just about establishing remote bases, but about recovering or accessing something that was already there? The ancient structures, the technology we've theorized about in previous chapters. What if Nazi scientists or researchers discovered evidence of this during their expeditions? What if that's what motivated their continued presence there? And what if that's what the Americans were really looking for when they sent Operation High Jump? Because if you're trying to develop advanced weapons technology and you hear rumors or find evidence of ancient technology that exceeded modern capabilities, you're going to be very interested in that. You're going to want to explore it, study it, potentially reverse engineer it. And if your enemies discover you're doing this, they're going to want to interrupt that process and claim the technology for themselves. That would turn Antarctica from a mapping mission into a race for ancient technology between competing powers, with both sides understanding that whoever gains access to what's under the ice gains a potential strategic advantage that could reshape the global balance of power. Whether this speculation is accurate or complete fantasy, what remains undeniable is that something unusual happened during Operation High Jump. Something significant enough that the official records remain heavily redacted. Witness testimony was suppressed, and the whole affair became classified at levels that prevent meaningful historical research even decades later. That level of secrecy, combined with Admiral Byrd's warnings about threats from the polar regions, suggests that whatever they encountered in Antarctica in 1946 to 47 was considered a serious enough national security matter that it warranted keeping it hidden from public knowledge indefinitely. And that raises the final uncomfortable question. If they encountered something in 1946 that justified this level of suppression, is it still there? Is it still active? And are there ongoing operations in Antarctica, hidden under the cover of scientific research and environmental monitoring, that are actually about maintaining control of or preventing access to something that the powers that be really don't want? Anyone else discovering? Because if there are ancient structures with functional technology, if there are entrance points to underground systems, if there are energy sources or knowledge repositories hidden under the ice, then Antarctica isn't just a natural preserve. It's the most valuable real estate on the planet. And the international treaty that supposedly keeps it neutral might actually be a coordinated effort by major powers to ensure that nobody else gets access to what's really down there. Fun thought to keep you awake at night. So after Operation High Jump went sideways in 1947, and everyone involved was politely but firmly told to never speak about it again, you might think the international community would have gotten together and said, "You know what? Maybe we should establish some ground rules for Antarctica before this gets out of hand." And that's exactly what happened. In 1959, during the height of the Cold War, when the United States and Soviet Union could barely agree on what day of the week it was, 12 nations somehow managed to come together and sign the Antarctic Treaty. This treaty, which went into effect in 1961, established Antarctica as a scientific preserve, banned military activity, prohibited nuclear testing and radioactive waste disposal, and, most interestingly for our purposes, froze all territorial claims, and placed strict controls on what could and couldn't be done on the continent. It's presented as this wonderful example of international cooperation, a triumph of peaceful scientific collaboration over nationalist competition, which is a nice story. The kind of story you tell when you don't want anyone asking uncomfortable questions about what everyone was really so eager to control access to. Let's look at what the Antarctic Treaty actually does beyond the feel-good rhetoric about scientific cooperation. It prohibits military bases and fortifications, which makes sense if you're trying to prevent the continent from becoming a Cold War battleground. It bans weapons testing and military maneuvers. Again, reasonable on the surface. It prohibits mining and mineral extraction, ostensibly to protect the environment, which is genuinely important. But here's the interesting part. While the treaty allows for freedom of scientific investigation, it also establishes that any discoveries made during such investigations fall under strict protocols controlled by the signatory nations. Archaeological findings, in particular, get classified under the broad umbrella of scientific research, which means they're subject to review and potential classification by government bodies before any public disclosure. In other words, if you're conducting research in Antarctica and you discover something significant, let's say, hypothetically, ancient structures or artifacts that challenge conventional history, you can't just publish your findings and hold a press conference. You report to your National Antarctic Program, which reports to the relevant government agencies, who then decide what information gets released and what information stays locked in a filing cabinet somewhere. It's academic freedom with a very large asterisk that says, "except when we decide it isn't." Now, is this necessarily sinister? Not automatically. There are legitimate reasons to control information about sensitive discoveries. Preventing looting, ensuring proper archaeological methodology, maintaining site integrity, avoiding premature conclusions based on incomplete data. But it also creates a convenient mechanism for suppressing discoveries that might be inconvenient, controversial, or paradigm-shifting. And when you combine strict access controls with classification protocols, you end up with a situation where significant findings can be made, documented, and effectively disappeared from public knowledge without anyone outside a small circle of cleared personnel ever knowing they existed. It's the perfect system for maintaining the official narrative about Antarctica while quietly dealing with anything that contradicts that narrative. Not saying that's definitely what's happening. Just saying it would be very easy to make it happen within the existing framework. And we'd have no way of knowing unless someone broke their secrecy agreements and talked. Which, fortunately for those of us interested in the truth, occasionally happens. Whistleblowers are a fascinating phenomenon because they're essentially people who decide that their conscience or their commitment to truth is more important than their career, their freedom, or potentially their safety. And over the years, various individuals with direct experience in Antarctic operations have come forward with claims about discoveries that never made it into peer-reviewed journals or public discourse. Some of these claims are easier to dismiss. Second-hand accounts, vague descriptions, no supporting evidence. But others come from credible sources with verifiable backgrounds who provide specific details about what they observed. Take, for instance, reports from military personnel who were stationed at various Antarctic bases or participated in special operations there. Several have described coordinated excavation efforts in restricted zones. Areas that aren't marked on public maps, areas where civilian researchers aren't allowed, areas where significant resources and personnel are deployed for operations that are officially described as routine maintenance or infrastructure projects, but involve specialized equipment more consistent with archaeological excavation or materials recovery than with fixing generators or clearing snow. In 2018, journalist and researcher Linda Moulton Howe released testimony from a source claiming to be a retired Navy SEAL who had participated in classified operations in Antarctica. Now, before anyone jumps in with, "Oh, anonymous sources making wild claims," it's worth noting that this source provided verification of his military service, specific operational details that checked out against known deployments, and enough circumstantial evidence to suggest he was, at minimum, who he claimed to be. According to his testimony, he was part of a team sent to Antarctica to provide security for scientists conducting work at what was officially described as an archaeological site. The site itself was reportedly in one of those ice-free areas we discussed earlier, a geothermal region where natural heating kept certain cave systems accessible without requiring extensive ice removal. The team was briefed that they were protecting researchers studying ancient remains. But when they actually arrived at the site, what they encountered was significantly more impressive than some old ruins. We're talking about structures with intact architecture, technological artifacts that didn't match any known historical civilization, and evidence of engineering sophistication that seemed completely out of place for anything that should exist in Antarctica's known history. And here's the kicker. After the operation concluded, all personnel involved were subjected to extensive debriefings, required to sign additional non-disclosure agreements, and explicitly warned that discussing anything they'd witnessed could result in prosecution under national security laws. Because apparently, ancient ruins are a matter of national security, which they definitely would be if those ruins contain technology or knowledge that major powers want to control access to. Now, why would archaeological discoveries require military-grade secrecy? If you discover ancient pottery shards or old bones, that's interesting for academics, but it's not exactly classified information that needs to be locked away in government vaults. But if you discover evidence of advanced ancient technology, if you find artifacts that demonstrate capabilities we're still struggling to replicate, if you uncover knowledge that fundamentally challenges the accepted timeline of human civilization and technological development, then suddenly you're not dealing with archaeology anymore. You're dealing with potential strategic advantages, intellectual property rights on a civilizational scale, and information that could destabilize the comfortable narratives that most of human society is built on. If the technology is recoverable and functional, whoever controls it gains advantages in energy generation, transportation, materials science, or whatever other fields the technology touches. If the knowledge is translatable, whoever understands it first gets a head start in developing applications. And if the evidence is undeniable, if it's so clear that ancient civilizations achieved things we thought only modern society could achieve, then you're looking at a mass reevaluation of human history that would affect everything from education, curricula to religious beliefs, to national origin stories. That's the kind of discovery that governments might prefer to control, analyze privately, and disclose gradually on their own terms rather than letting it explode across the internet and cause immediate social disruption. Multiple whistleblower accounts from different sources across different time periods describe similar patterns. Coordinated excavations in restricted areas, rapid removal of discovered artifacts, immediate classification of findings, and aggressive enforcement of secrecy protocols. These aren't people claiming they saw alien spacecraft or got abducted by Antarctic cryptids. These are trained personnel describing professional archaeological and recovery operations conducted with military precision and government-level resources. Operations that are kept carefully separate from the public-facing scientific research that gets published and discussed openly. The existence of these parallel operations, official civilian science on one track, classified military-supervised excavations on another, suggests that authorities are very much aware of significant discoveries in Antarctica and are making deliberate choices about what information gets shared publicly and what stays locked down. And before anyone says, well, maybe they're just being cautious until they can properly study and verify findings, remember that some of these operations have been going on for decades. How long does it take to verify findings? How many years of study are required before the public can be trusted with information about their own planet's history? At a certain point, prolonged classification stops being cautious scientific methodology and starts being deliberate suppression of information that powerful institutions would prefer remained unknown. The Antarctic Treaty comes up for review and renewal periodically, and each time, the same nations that signed the original agreement continue to maintain strict control over access and activities on the continent. New nations have joined over the years. The treaty now has over 50 signatory countries. But the core provisions remain unchanged. Antarctica stays off limits to independent exploration, mining, or development. All activities require governmental approval. All findings go through official channels. And this arrangement is presented as environmental protection and scientific cooperation, which it partly is, but it also serves as perfect cover for maintaining control over whatever else is down there. It's worth asking, if Antarctica is just ice and penguins and interesting geology, why do major world powers care so much about maintaining strict control? Why does the treaty get renewed without significant changes despite numerous requests from various parties to loosen restrictions? What exactly are we protecting Antarctica from? Environmental damage is the official answer, and that's legitimate. Antarctica is a pristine ecosystem that should be preserved. But environmental protection doesn't require the level of classification and secrecy that surrounds certain Antarctic activities. You can protect an environment while still being transparent about what research is being conducted and what's being discovered. Unless what you're really protecting isn't the environment, but rather your exclusive access to discoveries that might be inconveniently paradigm-shifting. Now, here's where the situation gets deliciously ironic. Despite all the treaties, all the secrecy protocols, all the careful control over who can access what parts of Antarctica and what information gets disclosed, there's one force that completely ignores human attempts at suppression: climate change. And before this becomes a debate about the causes or politics of climate change, let's just focus on the observable fact. The Antarctic ice sheet is melting rapidly, in ways that are measurably, documentably happening regardless of anyone's opinion about why it's happening. NASA satellite data shows that West Antarctica alone has been losing approximately 60 cubic kilometers of ice per year since 2009. To put that in perspective, because cubic kilometers is a measurement that means nothing to most humans, that's roughly equivalent to 70,000 Empire State Buildings worth of ice disappearing into the ocean annually, every year. That's not a slow, gradual process. That's geologically rapid ice loss. The kind of loss that, if it continues at current rates, will expose land that's been buried for thousands of years within our lifetimes, possibly within the next few decades. And here's what makes this fascinating from a hidden secrets perspective. The ice isn't melting uniformly. Some areas of Antarctica are actually gaining ice. Certain regions are experiencing increased snowfall and ice accumulation. But other areas, particularly West Antarctica and certain coastal regions, are losing ice dramatically fast. The pattern of melting isn't what you'd expect from simple global temperature increase, which would cause relatively uniform melting across the continent. Instead, the pattern is selective, almost targeted. Some glaciers are retreating at rates that shock glaciologists who study them. Some ice shelves are breaking apart and disappearing. Some regions that were buried under hundreds of feet of ice just decades ago are now exposing bare rock, mountain formations, and, wait for it, structures that are beginning to protrude through the ice cover. Whether this selective melting is due to ocean current patterns, bedrock geology, varying ice sheet thickness, or something else is actively debated. But the result is that specific locations in Antarctica are being revealed much faster than others. And some of those locations happen to correspond with areas where anomalies have been detected, where ancient structures have been reported, where unusual electromagnetic signatures exist. Researchers studying the melting patterns have noted something else unusual: temperature anomalies in certain regions where ice loss is accelerated. These aren't atmospheric temperature variations. Those are well documented and expected. These are localized thermal anomalies detected beneath the ice, suggesting heat sources that are either volcanic, geothermal, or, and this is where conventional explanations start getting uncomfortable, something else entirely. Some of these thermal signatures don't match known volcanic activity patterns. They're not located where you'd expect to find magma chambers or volcanic vents. They're not producing the kinds of gas emissions or seismic activity you'd associate with volcanic heat. They're just warm spots under the ice, generating enough heat to accelerate melting from below, creating cavities and channels that weaken the ice structure and lead to faster surface melting and glacier retreat. It's like someone turned on heaters under specific parts of the continent and forgot to turn them off, which is an absurd explanation if you're thinking in purely natural terms, but becomes less absurd if you consider that ancient thermal management systems, the kind we speculated about when discussing the subglacial lakes, might still be functioning on some level, still generating residual heat, and that heat is now contributing to accelerated ice loss in the regions where these systems are located. The acceleration of melting in the 21st century, particularly since around 2009, has been dramatic enough that even conservative scientific estimates suggest significant portions of Antarctic coastal ice will be gone within 50 to 100 years. More aggressive models based on current melting rates suggest certain regions could be substantially ice-free within 30 years. That's not geological time. That's people alive today will see this happen time. And what's underneath that ice? Well, officially, we expect to see mostly rock, maybe some exposed mountain peaks, potentially some interesting geological formations. But based on everything we've discussed, the radar anomalies, the reported structures, the Antarctic pyramids, the octagonal buildings, the testimony from personnel who've claimed to witness significant archaeological finds, what we might actually see is a revelation of evidence that's been preserved under ice for so long that it passed from history into legend, and from legend into forgotten myth. We might see proof, undeniable and visible to anyone with satellite imagery access, that advanced civilizations existed in Antarctica before the Ice Age. We might see structures emerge that can't be explained away as natural formations because they'll be too obviously artificial, too geometrically precise, too architecturally sophisticated. And at that point, the suppression becomes impossible. You can classify documents, you can silence whistleblowers, you can control access to sites, but you can't hide a pyramid or a city that's visible from space. This is why some researchers have suggested that climate change, whatever its causes, might actually be functioning as a form of gradual disclosure, not intentional disclosure orchestrated by governments. They'd probably prefer the ice stay in place indefinitely. But natural disclosure forced by planetary processes that humans can't control. The ice is melting. The structures are being revealed. And there's no putting that genie back in the bottle. Every year, satellite imagery improves. Every year, more of Antarctica becomes accessible as ice retreats. Every year, more people with cameras, drones, and internet access visit the continent. Eventually, someone is going to photograph or document something that's impossible to ignore or dismiss. Someone is going to capture clear evidence of structures that shouldn't exist. And that evidence is going to spread across social media faster than any classification protocol can contain it. The traditional mechanisms of information control, classification, debunking, marginalization of researchers who make unusual claims, work when the evidence is ambiguous, when access is restricted, when the only witnesses are people who can be discredited or silenced. They don't work when the evidence is visible from orbit and accessible to anyone with Google Earth. The irony is that climate change, often discussed as an environmental catastrophe, a threat to ecosystems and human civilization, might simultaneously be the mechanism that forces disclosure of information about previous civilizations and previous environmental catastrophes. If Antarctica does hold evidence of advanced ancient cultures that were destroyed by or forced to abandon the continent due to climate change in the distant past, then current climate change is creating a parallel situation in reverse. Instead of burying civilizations under ice, it's exposing them. Instead of destroying evidence, it's revealing it. The planet is essentially opening a time capsule that it sealed thousands or millions of years ago. And the timing is completely independent of human preferences about when or whether we'd like to confront that information. Nature doesn't care about government secrecy protocols. Geological and climatological processes don't pause for classified review. The ice melts according to thermodynamic principles, not according to what information security officials would prefer remained hidden. And that means we're entering a period where control over Antarctic discoveries, control that's been carefully maintained since the 1950s through treaties, classifications, and access restrictions, is going to become increasingly difficult to maintain. You can already see signs of this losing battle in the way certain stories and findings leak out, despite official suppression efforts. Satellite imagery showing anomalous formations gets noticed by independent researchers and circulated online before official explanations can be established. Personnel who participated in classified operations reach retirement age and decide their non-disclosure agreements aren't worth maintaining when compared to historical truth. Journalists and documentary makers increasingly focus on Antarctic mysteries because public interest is high and the questions are compelling. The official position remains: nothing unusual is happening in Antarctica, just normal scientific research and environmental monitoring. But that position becomes harder to maintain every time new evidence surfaces, every time another whistleblower comes forward, every time satellite imagery reveals something that looks suspiciously like artificial architecture, where officially there should only be ice and rock. The conventional narrative is cracking, not because of some coordinated disclosure effort, but because the evidence is accumulating to the point where it can no longer be ignored or dismissed with standard debunking responses. What makes this situation particularly interesting is the catch-22 it creates for authorities who might prefer to keep information suppressed. If they acknowledge significant discoveries, they have to explain why those discoveries were kept secret. which opens up questions about what else has been hidden and what the real objectives of Antarctic operations have been. If they continue to deny that anything unusual has been found, they risk being contradicted by increasingly undeniable visual evidence as the ice continues to melt. If they attempt to restrict access further or tighten information controls, they draw attention to the fact that they're trying to hide something. It's a no-win situation from a secrecy standpoint. The optimal outcome for maintaining control would have been for the ice to remain stable indefinitely, keeping everything buried and inaccessible, but that's not happening. The ice is melting whether anyone wants it to or not, and with it, the ability to maintain plausible deniability about what lies beneath. So we're approaching a potential inflection point in human history, a moment when physical evidence of ancient advanced civilizations becomes so visible and so undeniable that the conventional historical narrative has to be revised, whether academics and governments want to revise it or not. This isn't some far future possibility. Based on current melting rates and the locations of known anomalies, we're talking about the next 10 to 30 years. Within the next generation, it's entirely possible that Antarctica will force us to confront questions we've been avoiding. Who were we before we became who we are? What happened to previous advanced civilizations? What can we learn from their rise and fall? And critically, are we doomed to repeat their mistakes? Or can we use their example to avoid whatever catastrophe befell them? These aren't just academic questions. These are existential questions about human civilization's trajectory, our place in the long arc of intelligent life on Earth, and whether we're smart enough to learn from history. Even history that's been buried under ice for so long that we forgot it existed. The climate is changing. The ice is melting. The secrets are emerging. And unlike every other time in history when powerful institutions successfully controlled information about significant discoveries, this time there's no mechanism to stop the disclosure. Nature is doing it for us, on its own timeline, according to its own processes. The only question remaining is whether we're ready to accept what's about to be revealed, or whether we'll waste energy and credibility trying to deny the obvious, even as structures that shouldn't exist begin to emerge from beneath the ice, like memories surfacing from planetary amnesia. My money's on the evidence winning. Personally, facts tend to outlast denial, especially when those facts are big enough to see from space. But the transition is going to be messy, controversial, and probably pretty entertaining to watch as various institutions scramble to maintain narratives that are becoming increasingly untenable. Grab your popcorn. The next few decades are going to be interesting. All right, so we've covered ancient history, Nazi shenanigans, government suppression, and melting ice revealing secrets. Now let's talk about something that happened recently enough that we can't blame it on faulty historical records or misremembered accounts. I'm talking about 2018, modern times, the age of satellite imagery, real-time tracking, and technology that can photograph license plates from orbit if someone really wants to. The age where it's increasingly difficult to hide anything on Earth's surface because multiple nations and private companies have satellites constantly watching everything. And in 2018, those satellites caught something over Antarctica that absolutely should not exist according to our current understanding of aerospace engineering and physics. But it does exist. It was photographed. And the math behind it is so wildly impossible that the only explanations are either we're missing something fundamental about atmospheric physics, or there's technology operating in our skies that's so far beyond publicly acknowledged capabilities that we might as well be comparing a horse-drawn carriage to a spacecraft. Here's what happened. Satellite imaging detected a contrail, a condensation trail, the white line you see behind aircraft when water vapor in the exhaust condenses in cold air, extending from the North Pole to the South Pole, pole to pole, a continuous line stretching approximately 12,000 miles. Now, If you're thinking, okay, so some plane flew from one pole to the other, what's the big deal? Congratulations. You've identified the exact problem that makes this impossible. Let's do some basic math. The kind that doesn't require an advanced degree, just a calculator and a willingness to accept what the numbers tell us. Contrails dissipate. They don't last forever. Atmospheric conditions, wind, temperature, humidity. All of these factors determine how long a contrail remains visible. In optimal conditions, a contrail might persist for 30 minutes, maybe an hour in exceptional circumstances. For our purposes, let's be extremely generous and say this contrail could have lasted 30 minutes before dissipating. That means whatever created it would have had to travel 12,000 miles in 30 minutes to leave a continuous trail from pole to pole before the beginning of the trail disappeared. Let me repeat that because it's important. 12,000 miles in 30 minutes. Let's do the math. That's 400 miles per minute. That's roughly 6.6 miles per second. That's approximately 24,000 miles per hour. Actually, wait, I made an error. That's assuming the trail lasted 30 minutes. If we're being realistic about contrail persistence under Antarctic atmospheric conditions, we're probably looking at more like 10 to 15 minutes maximum, which means the object would need to be traveling even faster. Let's say 15 minutes. That gives us 12,000 miles in 15 minutes, which works out to 48,000 miles per hour. For reference, the SR-71 Blackbird, one of the fastest aircraft ever built, a plane that set speed records that still stand, maxed out at about 2,200 miles per hour. The X-15 rocket plane, which holds the record for fastest manned aircraft, reached about 4,500 miles per hour. This contrail suggests something traveling roughly 10 times faster than the fastest aircraft humanity has ever publicly acknowledged building. Totally normal. Nothing to see here. Just casual physics violations happening over the most restricted and monitored continent on Earth. But wait, it gets better. Because speed is only part of the problem. The trajectory of this contrail went directly through both poles, North Pole to South Pole, or vice versa. That's not a normal flight path. Aircraft don't fly pole to pole. There's no reason to fly that route. There's nothing at either pole except ice, research stations, and apparently mysteries that governments would prefer stayed buried. But more importantly, flying directly through the poles means flying perpendicular to Earth's rotation, which introduces additional atmospheric resistance and navigational challenges. It means crossing through some of the most extreme weather conditions on the planet. The polar jet streams, atmospheric turbulence, temperature variations that would stress any conventional aircraft design. And doing all of this at speeds that would generate atmospheric friction hot enough to melt most known materials. Because here's the fun part about traveling through atmosphere at hypersonic speeds. Air resistance creates heat, a lot of heat. The space shuttle entering Earth's atmosphere traveled at about 17,000 miles per hour. And it required specialized heat-resistant tiles covering its entire surface to prevent burning up. And that was in the thin, upper atmosphere. Whatever created this contrail was traveling at roughly 3 times that speed through much denser atmosphere at lower altitudes where contrails form, typically between 25,000 and 40,000 feet. The thermal management required to survive those conditions exceeds anything in the public technological arsenal. We're talking about materials science and propulsion systems that officially don't exist. Unless, of course, they do exist, and we're just not supposed to know about them. Now, let's address the skeptical explanations that inevitably come up when discussing this. Maybe it was multiple aircraft flying in sequence. Except multiple aircraft would leave multiple contrails with gaps between them as each successive aircraft follows the same route after the previous contrail dissipates. This was photographed as a continuous line. Maybe it was a satellite glitch or imaging artifact. Except the contrail appeared on multiple satellite systems operated by different nations, which rules out single system malfunction. Maybe it was some kind of atmospheric phenomenon. Except atmospheric phenomena don't create perfectly straight lines from pole to pole, and they definitely don't create condensation trails that look exactly like aircraft contrails. The conventional explanations require more suspension of disbelief than the unconventional one. Something was flying from one pole to the other at speeds that exceed publicly acknowledged technology, leaving a contrail as evidence of its passage. Either multiple governments have developed aerospace capabilities far beyond what they're admitting, which is possible, black budget programs do exist. Or there's something else going on entirely. Something that doesn't fit neatly into our categories of known technology. And this isn't the only unusual thing satellites have captured over Antarctica. High-resolution imaging has revealed something else that's gotten significantly less attention than it deserves. Probably because it raises questions that nobody in official channels wants to answer. In one of the Antarctic mountain ranges, there's a hole. Not a cave entrance, not a natural geological formation, but a perfectly circular opening in the rock face. And when I say perfectly circular, I mean geometrically precise, smooth edges. The kind of circularity that screams artificial construction. This isn't a crack or a collapsed lava tube or erosion creating a vaguely round hole that sort of looks circular if you're charitable. This is an engineered entrance, maybe a few hundred feet in diameter, large enough to accommodate significant traffic, positioned in a location that's remote, elevated, and about as difficult to access as anywhere on Earth. Why would anyone build a massive circular entrance in an Antarctic mountain? Great question. The official position is that it doesn't exist, or it's a natural feature being misinterpreted, or it's none of anyone's business what's there. None of these are particularly satisfying answers. But here's what makes this hole fascinating beyond just its existence. Satellite tracking has detected objects entering and exiting through it. Not weather phenomena, not birds. Objects, moving at high speeds, following trajectories that suggest controlled flight rather than natural movement. Objects that appear on tracking systems briefly, showing velocities that are abnormally high, then disappearing into or emerging from this mountain opening before the tracking systems can get detailed data. It's like watching planes take off and land at an airport. Except this airport is carved into an Antarctic mountain, isn't on any official maps, and the planes are moving at speeds that would make air traffic controllers have panic attacks. If you wanted to establish a transportation hub connecting remote locations with minimal observation, say, for moving personnel, equipment, or information between the poles without using conventional surface or air routes, carving an entrance into a remote Antarctic mountain and using some kind of advanced propulsion system that allows for rapid transit would be a pretty good way to do it. It wouldn't eliminate all traces. Satellites are too ubiquitous for that. But it would minimize casual observation and make it difficult for anyone without access to high-level satellite data to even know the hub exists. The existence of this entrance and the associated traffic suggests that Antarctica isn't just a frozen storage facility for ancient secrets. It's actively being used for something, by someone, with technology that's either classified human development so advanced that it might as well be alien, or it's something else entirely that we don't have good frameworks for understanding. And the fact that this is connected to the pole-to-pole contrail raises interesting questions about whether there's a network here. A transportation network. Connecting the poles, potentially connecting to other locations globally, using technology that operates at speeds and with capabilities that exceed everything we're told exists. It's the kind of infrastructure you'd build if you wanted to move things around the planet without using commercial flight paths, without using conventional aircraft that show up on standard radar. without leaving evidence that civilian monitoring systems could easily detect and track. It's the infrastructure of a parallel civilization, or a classified program with resources and technology so far beyond public knowledge that it's functionally operating as a separate entity. Now, connecting all of this, the contrails, the entrance, the objects, the suppressed expeditions, the ancient structures, the electromagnetic anomalies, the melting ice revealing more evidence every year, we arrive at an unavoidable conclusion. Antarctica isn't just an interesting mystery. It's not just a place where weird stuff happened in the past and now it's frozen and forgotten. It's an active location where things are happening right now, where secrets are being maintained, where technology is being employed that shouldn't exist according to public understanding, and where the natural process of climate change is forcing disclosure that no amount of classification can prevent. We're standing on the threshold of revelation. Not because anyone decided it was time to reveal the truth, but because the planet itself is revealing what's been hidden. The ice is melting. The structures are emerging. The evidence is accumulating. And at some point very soon, the weight of that evidence is going to exceed the capacity of any suppression effort to contain it. Think about what we've covered in this journey. We started with ancient maps showing Antarctica without ice, mapped with accuracy that shouldn't be possible in the medieval period. We discovered geometric structures under the ice, detected by modern radar and displaying precision that suggests artificial construction. We found electromagnetic anomalies consistent with large metallic or technological objects buried beneath miles of frozen water. We explored subglacial lakes that maintain liquid water at impossible temperatures, suggesting either geothermal anomalies or ancient thermal management systems still generating heat. We examined octagonal structures and pyramids with characteristics that match ancient construction around the world, suggesting a global civilization with unified architectural knowledge. We looked at Operation High Jump and the Nazi Antarctic expeditions, both suggesting that modern powers discovered something significant enough to warrant military intervention and decades of suppression. We've seen whistleblower testimony describing classified excavations and discoveries that never made it into public records. We've watched satellite imagery document the accelerating melt of Antarctic ice, exposing what's been hidden beneath. And we've just examined evidence of advanced aerospace technology operating in the present day, connecting the poles through some kind of high-speed transportation system that officially doesn't exist. Each of these pieces, taken individually, could be dismissed, explained away, or attributed to coincidence. But when you assemble them all together, when you look at the pattern formed by the accumulated evidence, a picture emerges that's difficult to ignore. Antarctica was home to something or someone with advanced capabilities. Whether that was an ancient human civilization, some kind of visiting intelligence, or both, is unclear. What is clear is that evidence of this presence remains, buried under ice, hidden in restricted zones, actively being suppressed by governments that decided the public wasn't ready for information that would challenge fundamental assumptions about human history and technological development. And now, through the unstoppable process of climate change, that evidence is being revealed whether anyone wants it to be or not. The ice is melting at rates that ensure significant exposure within our lifetimes. The structures that have been hidden for thousands or millions of years are beginning to protrude through the ice cover. Satellite imagery is becoming detailed enough that independent researchers can examine Antarctic features without requiring official approval or access. The mechanisms of suppression that worked when Antarctica was completely inaccessible and tightly controlled are failing because you can't classify what's visible from space. And you can't stop people from asking questions about what they can see. With their own eyes on publicly available satellite imagery, the question facing humanity isn't, is there something significant in Antarctica? The evidence already answers that question with a pretty definitive yes. The question is, what do we do when the full revelation occurs? When the ice melts enough that massive structures become undeniably visible? When the pyramids are fully exposed and can be photographed and measured? When the octagonal buildings with their thermal regulation and glowing walls can be accessed and explored? When the transportation hubs and technological artifacts can no longer be denied or explained away? Do we collectively acknowledge that human civilization's timeline needs to be completely rewritten? Do we accept that we're not the first advanced culture on this planet, just the most recent one? Do we grapple with the implications of civilizational collapse on scales large enough that entire technologically sophisticated societies could disappear so thoroughly that they passed from memory into myth? These aren't comfortable questions. They challenge the narratives we've built our educational systems, our historical frameworks, and our cultural identities around. But they're questions we're going to have to face, because the planet isn't giving us a choice. Antarctica is thawing. The past is emerging. And denial, while comfortable, has an expiration date. Here's the thing about civilizational amnesia. It's surprisingly easy to lose knowledge when systems collapse. Libraries burn. Oral traditions get distorted over generations. Written records decay. People die without passing on what they knew. Give it a few centuries of chaos and reconstruction, and detailed technological knowledge becomes simplified folklore. Give it a few millennia, and history becomes mythology. Give it tens of thousands of years, and you're left with fragments, mysterious artifacts, inexplicable structures, legends about gods and heroes that might actually be distorted memories of real historical figures and events. If an advanced civilization existed in Antarctica before the Ice Age, and if that civilization was destroyed or forced to abandon the continent when climate catastrophe struck, the survivors would have scattered to other regions. They would have carried some knowledge with them, but not everything. Without the infrastructure, the libraries, the institutional knowledge systems that advanced societies rely on, that knowledge would degrade rapidly. Within a few generations, you'd go from, "We came from a great civilization in the south," to, "Our ancestors were gods who lived beyond the ice," to, "There are myths about powerful beings from a forgotten land." The actual history becomes legend, legend becomes myth, myth becomes dismissed as pure fiction, and the physical evidence, buried under ice so thoroughly that nobody even knows to look for it. This is what might have happened before. This is what the Antarctic evidence suggests happened before. A civilization rose, achieved remarkable things, left its mark across the planet in the form of structures and knowledge that later cultures partially preserved without understanding their origin. Then something catastrophic occurred. Climate change, cosmic impact, technological failure, we don't know. And the civilization collapsed. Antarctica froze. The survivors rebuilt, but without access to the accumulated knowledge and infrastructure of their predecessors. And over time, memory of what came before faded into legend and myth until finally even the myths were forgotten, and we convinced ourselves we were the first ones to achieve civilization, to develop technology, to map the world. But we weren't. We're just the first ones to do it since the last reset. And if that's true, if we're one chapter in a longer story of rise and fall and rise again, then it changes everything about how we think about progress, about civilization's trajectory, about our own potential longevity as a technological society. Because if it's happened before, it can happen again. And if we don't learn from whatever destroyed our predecessors, we're setting ourselves up to repeat their mistakes. The revelation that's coming, when the ice finally melts enough that the evidence is undeniable, isn't just about discovering ancient ruins. It's about confronting our own fragility. It's about acknowledging that civilization, no matter how advanced or powerful it seems, is contingent on conditions that can change. It's about recognizing that we're not immune to the forces, environmental, cosmic, technological, that can bring down even sophisticated societies. And hopefully, if we're smart and humble enough to actually learn from the evidence, rather than just treating it as an archaeological curiosity, it's about using that knowledge to avoid the same fate. Because here's the sobering thought. Whatever happened to the civilization that built the Antarctic pyramids and octagonal structures, whatever catastrophe or cascade of failures brought them down, it's not guaranteed that we're better prepared to handle those challenges just because we have smartphones and satellites and nuclear weapons. We might be just as vulnerable. We might be heading toward our own collapse without recognizing the warning signs. Or we might have the opportunity, by studying what came before, to break the cycle. To be the civilization that survives instead of the one that gets buried under ice and forgotten. Antarctica stands at the threshold of revelation, not because we chose to investigate our past, but because the planet is forcing us to confront it. The ice is melting. The secrets are emerging. The evidence is accumulating. And within our lifetimes, within the next few decades at most, we're going to have to decide whether we're brave enough to look honestly at what's being revealed and adjust our understanding of human history accordingly, or whether we're going to cling to comfortable myths about our uniqueness and primacy, even as the physical evidence contradicts those myths. My suspicion is that evidence will win. Reality has a way of insisting on itself. You can ignore facts, dismiss findings, suppress information, but you can't ultimately hide structures the size of pyramids when they're sitting in full view of satellite cameras that anyone can access. The truth will out, as the saying goes. And when it does, when Antarctica's secrets are finally fully exposed and documented and undeniable, we'll look back at this period. The period when we knew something was there but couldn't quite bring ourselves to acknowledge it. And wonder why we found it so difficult to accept what should have been obvious all along. The white void that remembers is finally remembering out loud. The continent that's been keeping secrets is running out of ice to hide them under. The structures are emerging. The evidence is mounting. The questions are becoming harder to ignore. And soon, very soon, the world is going to have to acknowledge that our history is far stranger, far older, and far more complex than we've been willing to admit. Antarctica is about to rewrite everything we thought we knew about ourselves. The only question remaining is whether we're ready to read what it's written beneath all that ice. Personally, I think it's going to be the most fascinating book we've ever opened, even if it's also one of the most unsettling. Because learning that you're not the first, that others came before and failed, is humbling. But learning from their failure, that might be the most valuable knowledge we could possibly gain. And Antarctica, in its frozen patience, has been waiting millions of years to teach us that lesson. Ready or not, class is about to begin.